All right, good morning, everyone. So the 2 Corinthians books are out in the foyer. I believe if all went according to plan, y'all finished up 1 Corinthians while I was gone. I will confirm that, but as far as I know, we are starting 2 Corinthians on Wednesday. So if it's not that, it'll be very, very soon. So please pick one of those up if you haven't already, and we will begin looking at Paul's second letter to the Corinthian church and see how things have changed. He went through a lot of problems in the first letter, and so there are some more things that need to be addressed and some resolutions that have happened, all sorts of good things that we can go over. I do appreciate Scott teaching for me while I was out of town. We are in 1 Samuel. We're going to be in chapter 9, but there's a few verses at the end of chapter 8 that y'all ran out of time for at the end that I wanted to go ahead and cover. 1 Samuel 8 was when Israel was demanding a king. Over and over, they are telling Samuel, we need a king to be like the nations over us. Samuel tried to warn them and to be like the nations around us. And then Samuel tried to warn them, this is what a king is going to do to you. This is what he's going to be like. He is going to tax you. He is going to draft your sons into his army. He is going to want to build up a palace for himself. He's going to want to do all of these things. And you still want this? And the last few verses of the chapter, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So Samuel has tried to warn them. He's tried to tell them that a king is not all it's cracked up to be, and that there's some significant problems with having a king. And then I think you probably talked about this some, and I know we've talked about it in earlier lessons, but it's important for us to remember that it was not the concept of a king that was sinful for Israel. That God had already promised Abraham that kings would come from his lineage. Jacob's blessing looked forward to the kings that would be in Judah's line. The law had instructions for kings. There seems to be this understanding that Israel is eventually going to have kings. And it doesn't even seem to be worded in this way that, well, even though it's sinful, this is going to happen. In this chapter, Israel has bad reasons and bad timing. They have the reasons of wanting to be like everyone else around them. They're already doing a pretty good job of that as they have been worshiping the gods of the people around them. They are not content to have God as their king. They want to be more secure, to be able to defend their borders, to be able to repel the Philistines and the other peoples who are around them. And instead of relying on God to defend them, they think that having a physical king is going to make those problems better. And as we know, once Israel got a physical king, they never had border disputes ever again. Obviously, that's not true. Like, having a king does not magically make those things better. So their rationale is wrong, and then their timing is wrong. I think it's pretty easy to conclude that God eventually was going to bless them with a king, and when it was done with God's timing and in God's way, it was going to be a good thing for them. Yet their push for it here, well, that's how they end up with Saul. And Saul is not going to be the kind of king that they need, even if he's the kind of king that they want. So is there anything through the end of chapter 8 that you want to ask or that didn't get covered last week? Yeah, Dave.
Well, I think it's interesting what you pointed out here is that shows to me a complete lack of faith and trust in God when they said, we want kings that we can fight our battles for us. And God has
Right.
proven, unless he was punishing them, he has fought battles and they've endured unsurmountable odds. You know, they just, because God was with them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of important to me, that we should really contemplate that.
Yeah.
When we start asking or depending on a man or men to deliver us or protect us.
Yeah.
What you're saying, we don't care, God. Wouldn't they just trust in God, too? I don't
Yeah.
get that. You know,
Yeah.
it's interesting to see how it evolved,
Right.
you know, to this.
It is. Did we need a king to conquer Jericho? Did we need a king to take over the land and to take it for themselves? They didn't need a king for any of those things because God was defending them. God was empowering them. He was the one who was handing this blessing over to them. God hasn't said that he's going to stop. That once they're established in a land, that suddenly God's going to leave them up to their own devices and let them just figure it out. He will still defend them. He will still empower them so long as they're trusting him. And they stopped trusting in God a long time ago. I'm referring back to things in Joshua. We had all of Judges in between. And if Judges didn't convince you that Israel has stopped trusting in God, I don't know what will. It's been quite a decline. Okay, chapter 9. Whoops, hitting the wrong computer for slides. Okay, so we are introduced to a man named Saul. Question number 6, what qualities do you see in Saul that would make him desirable as a king?
He's good looking.
Yeah.
And he was tall.
Yeah. Okay, so we laugh. We think, what does it have to do with anything? Well, kind of a lot, right? The king is a symbol on top of everything that he does practically. And even though in reality, an ugly and short man should be able to do everything that a tall and handsome one does, the people need to look to the king as a leader, as a symbol, as a source of inspiration. And so to see this man who is handsome and tall, as he's head and shoulders above the people, this is the kind of man you look at and go, yeah, that's my king.
Well, to start out with, he was also very humble in the beginning.
He was. And this is worth noting. So we're going to tease out some characteristics of Saul throughout this because he does not start out too bad. I think he's got some problems, and the events of chapter 9 will help us. But, David had some problems when he started out. It's not necessarily insurmountable that Saul has some rough edges and some things that need to be matured and refined. What we see is that Saul starts out reasonably humble, reasonably faithful, a person who is not a bad candidate for king. But what is focused on here in the description is not his humility, though it was there. The things focused on in the description are things that Israel would be excited about. Namely, that he is handsome, that he is head and shoulders taller than any of the other people. What else is said about him? Dave?
Well, he comes from a wealthy family.
Yes.
First of all. But I'd rather comment on what's not said about him. And there's nothing mentioned about his relationship with God, if there even was one.
Right.
So that's kind of not to throw air on the side of negativity, but that's kind of concerning to me. Is that the first thing that people should have been thinking about? I mean, I know they were thinking about a king, but they should have been thinking about a godly king.
Right.
And they were not.
Right.
And that still goes on today.
Yep. I find that concerning as well. That what isn't said about Saul here is anything to do with his relationship with God, anything to do with his character. We do see some things that are good. Like, I don't want to take away from that point. We do see some things that are good from him, but look at the way that he's introduced. It's reflective on Saul to an extent, and it's reflective on what the people are looking for. I'd argue even more, that it doesn't really matter to them if he is humble, or in fact, humility might be a negative trait to them. They need a very powerful king who's going to be able to attack the Philistines. They need a warrior. They need a man of valor. Who cares if he's humble? Who cares if he has a relationship with God? We care that he is tall and handsome and powerful and from a wealthy family. The genealogy given here is fairly lengthy for what would be a brief introductory note normally. Kind of showing that this is old money, old powerful family in the nation, even though he is from Benjamin, the smallest of the tribes, that this is a pretty influential and powerful family. Mark?
Yeah, it's hard not to be biased when you know the ending of the story.
Sure.
It looks like the writer is trying to paint him as in a good way in this section. It's the people who have the issue because of the way they're asking them, and Samuel will sort that out later. But
Yes.
it looks like they're just trying to make Saul look like a good guy. He's very responsible. His dad relies on him. He goes out to look for things. He's concerned about his dad during this journey. He looks and seeks out Samuel, who's
Yeah.
a man of God. He sees him as a seer or whatever, or as
Yeah.
a prophet. So it looks like they're just trying to paint this picture of Saul fitting what the people wanted,
Yeah.
like what we've been saying. And it all looks really good.
Yeah.
He looks really good. He looks like a very responsible, young, strong, handsome, tall guy. Head and shoulders over everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that take. There's Saul, when we know how it ends, it's easy to paint it very negatively. I think there are opening concerns that are there that are going to develop more, but really what we see out of Saul is a man who can go either direction. A man who can build his faith in God and build on the good traits he has to be closer to God, or a man who can give way to what the people want, which is a very physical, earthly leader who's going to rely on methods that don't have anything to do with God in order to rule over his nation. We know the way that it ends, but at this point in time, Saul's destiny is not set in stone. Saul can be who he wants to be and can decide which path he's going to take, and it very easily could have been Saul that the lineage of Jesus came from, that the reign stayed in for generations. It could have been him. It wasn't because of the choices he made. Gary?
As far as choosing to anoint him, it seems like that came from God. It sounds like God's the one that told Samuel, I'm sending you a man.
Oh, it is.
That's who you're to anoint as king.
Yes, absolutely. As much as this is somebody that Israel would be interested in, this was not an election. This was not a popular decision. Not a popular decision in the sense that the people all got together and chose who it was going to be. This is God's decision, and he picked someone that had this chance to be who God wanted him to be, but also fulfilled what the people were looking for. It's a very interesting choice by God. We'll get more into that as we go. Yes?
Jesus couldn't have come from him because he's the wrong lineage. He's from Benjamin, and it had to be somebody from Judah.
That's true. Yes, you're right. But still, even still, the line of kings could have come from Saul. That is what could have remained. And then it just would have been that Jesus would have come through David or through somebody else in Judah's line. But the kings could have been in Benjamin's line. And that's not what ended up happening, again, because of Saul's choices. Let's talk about what Saul's doing. You can make up your mind about his character and what you see in him, and whether there are concerning things or good things, and hopefully you'll see some of both. So Saul's father Kish has these donkeys, and they have wandered off. They are lost, and they don't know where to find them. Guess they needed some cattle guards. But Kish said to Saul his son, "Take one of the young men with you and arise and go and look for the donkeys." And so Saul and this servant have gone really a long way to look for the donkeys. All I can think is there must have been a substantial number of them. Of course, donkeys were very valuable back then, and so this would be something that you'd be interested in finding and would not be happy to see just wander off. But this isn't even a matter of them being, destitute and relying on this. Remember, they're wealthy, so this needs to be something substantial that they're willing to go looking for. And there's some providential power of God here as well in getting Saul away from home and to a situation where he can meet Samuel. So he's gone a long way. He's gone through the hill country of Ephraim. He's gone through part of the land of Benjamin. They're in multiple tribal territories looking for these donkeys. Like I said, this had to be more than one or two to go to all of this trouble. Something that you don't want to just write off. But when they get to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, "Come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us." So what do you think about this, of Saul's statement here on what he's been doing so far? How do you assess him? Yes, Betty.
Well, as a parent, I would be glad that he was concerned about my well-being, my work, and having had a bunch of children and they go off and you can't reach them and they're gone longer than they should be. So in a way, I think he was caring about his father.
Yeah.
He was caring about his worry for him. And he did, go, as we go, I don't want to get ahead of us here.
No.
But I thought that he had concern for his father.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is good. He's shown two really good things so far. One, that he's willing to go to a lot of effort to obey his father's command. He has not, this is a family of wealth. Okay, so put your stereotypical, he's not a kid here, but still, your stereotypical, rich son here. I'll go, take a quick look and get my father off my back and come back and say, "Sorry, Dad, couldn't find him." He goes to a substantial amount of effort. He's traveling through the land of Ephraim and land of Benjamin looking for these donkeys, but still in the back of his mind is concerned about his father's worry that his father might cease to care about the donkeys and care more about them. And that's good on his part, that he is willing to consider the whole picture. He's willing to care about his father's wishes, both for the donkeys and for him. I don't think there's much bad to say at this point. Saul's doing a good job of trying to fulfill his father's wishes, even in what surely had to be a frustrating circumstance of not being able to find these donkeys. Okay, Dave?
Well, a lot of that stuff could be circumstance, but I don't think this is one of those times. Because we keep going through, and I don't mean to jump ahead, but God definitely had a hand in it because he actually sent, I don't know if this is the right word, I don't want to make the wrong statement, but I believe God had influence in Saul going to see Saul the seer. And we see that Saul said, "Don't worry about it, we found him." And he wanted him to go there to anoint him. So God did. God wanted Saul to go there so that Saul could anoint him. So it's not by accident for sure, but it's interesting that he's scrambling around all over the place, and then they finally end up going to where Saul is.
Yeah.
Where
Samuel is, yes. Yeah, you're right. And I find this interesting as well, because this isn't, I agree with your take there, that this is not circumstance, that this is not just an accident, but this has happened, that God is providentially working to take these donkeys on whatever incredible journey they are on, but we're going to see they actually end up found and back home before Saul and the servant ever get there. So maybe this is a little bit like the milk cows that are led to go back to the people of Israel, and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant, that God is providentially involved in this way. But the whole point of this isn't really about the donkeys. The whole point of this is to get Saul to meet Samuel, and they're not in the same place right now. Saul needs to get away from his family, away from his home, even away from his servant, as we'll see, so that he's able to hear what Samuel has to say. So the servant is not quite willing to go back home yet. He really wants them to find these donkeys, and so he comes up with a suggestion. There's a man of God in this city. He's a man who is held in honor. All that he says comes true. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way we should go. Then Saul said to his servant, "But if we go, what can we bring the man? For the bread in our sacks is gone, and there is no present to bring to the man of God. What do we have?" The servant answered Saul again, "Here I have with me 1/4 shekel of silver, and I will give it to the man of God to tell us our way." So talk to me about this. What is the plan here, and what do they intend to do? Yeah, Dave.
They intend to hire Saul. Sorry, I keep myself. They intend to hire Samuel.
Okay.
To find the donkeys. But more importantly to me is that God is sending him there so he can get anointed. Now here's the kicker. We read about God didn't want them to have a king because he wanted he's their king, right? So you would step back and go, wait a minute, that's confusing. Maybe God did want it, but he wanted them to understand there's buyer's remorse coming. And we know that because they said the king's going to take everything, he's going to do this, that, and the other thing. Eventually, you'll see. So God basically, I guess he's not giving in to the people as you would think giving in how it is, but he's really, I think, he's really just saying, okay, you want that? Then guess what? You're going to find out the hard way.
Yeah.
And that did happen. So God had to prove them, test them, and he does that with us. He wants us to prove ourselves to him in our faith. And he wants to test us sometimes. And we need to keep our eyes open to see what that test is. And win it. But complete the test.
Yeah. Yeah, pass that test. Absolutely.
I'm stuttering and stuff, but it's a weird situation. It really, really is a weird situation.
It is a weird
Question
situation.
I have, you said 1/4 shekel. This guy's rich. He only offer him that.
Yeah. I have questions about this whole thing. I'm of two minds in it, and I'm really interested to hear your perspective and your feedback on this whole thing, because I don't know what to make of it. And I've turned this around a few times, and there's some good and there's some bad is kind of what I'm concluding from it. So the servant comes up with this plan. Let's go talk to the man of God. Maybe he can help us to find our donkeys. Saul agrees, thinks that's a good idea, but they don't have anything to offer the man of God. We know it was custom to offer a little morsel of food or some small thing like that. Saul has nothing. They've eaten all the bread in their sacks. They have nothing to offer. So it's a servant who comes up with the quarter shekel of silver to offer to the man of God, and they agree. So what do you think about this? Good or bad, and why? Yeah.
Well, it's good because it carries out God's plan.
Okay, so at least incidentally it's good because God is using this plan, using this to set in motion the events here. Absolutely. God is getting Saul and Samuel to meet so that Saul can be anointed king. So it's definitely good in that sense, but we also know that sometimes God uses people's questionable motivations or even outright sinful things in order to progress his plan. So we would need to go a little bit farther to be able to say that what Saul and the servant have come up with is actually a good thing or not. Mark?
I just saw him seeking advice from a man of God in this specific instance in these first few verses. And that tells me that he's seeking advice from God. And I didn't put anything else into that. You know, he was saying, should we go home? What should we do? And they said, well, let's go inquire of this man of God. And that's what they did. I don't think they had any, I don't see any motives here other than finding out what should we do? Should we go home? Dad's got to be worried about us. We've been gone too long. This is going on. And this kind of seems to be the basic motive behind it to me, as far as I can read into it. I know what happens later.
Sure.
I know at this point, he just seems to be going, what should we do? And then let's go talk to this man of God.
Okay, yeah, so seeking the advice of a man of God, not a bad thing, right? He's asking questions in the right places. They do think enough that they should probably offer something according to the custom. So Saul is not going to demand anything of the man of God. He wants to be able to offer him something. So I suppose that is good as well. I guess I have some questions about trying to use the man of God as a way to find the donkeys. That it seems a little trivial to me. It seems a little transactional in, well, let's go talk to the magic man over there, and maybe he can use his magic to help us find our donkeys. He can, and I don't know, maybe it's reading too much into it, because they do go to a man of God and not to, some oracle of a false god or anything like that. So that's good. But then, I don't know. The whole thing seems a little transactional and a little trivial in some ways. Gary?
I think it's possible that they were going to ask that man of God what they should do. Should we keep looking for the donkeys, or should we just go home the best advice from the man of God?
And maybe that would be, that's certainly possible, and it's hard to know how to read that either way, and that could probably be construed in a more positive light, for sure. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Well, the donkeys were very expensive.
Sure.
They weren't just anything. And like you hear about the men who had 30 sons and they all rode on
Right.
donkeys.
Yes.
So
Mm-hmm.
these were valuable
Oh, yes.
possessions. And if he had, just because his father had money doesn't mean that he had money. And if he had some, they'd be gone long enough, he'd probably spend it all.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think Saul is necessarily trying to be stingy here. It seems pretty plausible that as long as they've been gone, that they don't have anything anymore. That's good reason for him to say, time to go home. There's no bread, there's no money, there's nothing to do here. At the same time, the quarter shekel that's offered, as we compare later in, I think it's chapter 13, this is less than the amount that you would pay in order to get a weapon sharpened. So it is a pretty trivial sum at this point. I don't know. There's weird questions. Gary?
Well, we keep speculating in
Yeah.
these areas, but I don't know that they would think we need a lot of money to go on this trip. We have to have a lot of money.
Right.
They were their donkeys. I'm not sure they were planning on buying their donkeys back.
No.
When they found them, the donkeys belonged to them, so why do they need a lot of money? And they didn't know they were going to go to a seer
Yeah.
originally either. If they found the donkeys, they're done.
Right. No, I think the only money that they're likely to take on something like this is enough to make sure that they can pay for their incidental things on their trip. They don't know how long they're going to be gone. Take some money with you so that you can buy food, whatever. They don't expect to be making a large purchase. So it's hard to fault them for not having the money on hand, or even whether they should be doing this with Samuel at all. To add into the little twist that this is, the author of the book of Samuel adds in verse 9, trying to make this a little bit better than it sounds to his readers of that day. The whole thing of Saul and the servant calling Samuel a seer. Seer was a derogatory name later on, but he's saying now it didn't have that connotation then. So you can almost see the writer of Samuel writing it down, knowing that that is what they called Samuel, and wincing because you wouldn't call a prophet, a man of God, a seer, but then acknowledging, hey, this was common practice back then. It did not have that same derogatory connotation. They didn't mean any offense by it, which is what happens when you're talking about different time periods and the way language evolves. So we already have the writer of Samuel working a little bit to paint Saul in a more positive light than he looks like to his readers. So, okay. We'll go with that. We're going to give Saul the benefit of the doubt as much as we can, even though I still have a few lingering questions about this whole thing and exactly what he's trying to accomplish and whether this sort of transactional advice was entirely appropriate or not. That's not really the main point of the story anyway. Regardless of whether it was right or wrong, it's what they did. And it quickly gets replaced in consideration by the much more important conversation that Samuel is going to have with him. So this, I think, adds to the messiness of Saul. That there's a lot that's good about him, and then a few things that make you think in the back of your head, if he indulges this could be a bad turn for him, which of course we know is what happens eventually. So they go up to the city, go up to see the man of God. They first meet the young women who are coming out to draw water. They're asking, is the seer here? And they say, he is. Go on up into the city. He's here to bless an offering so that the people can eat at this feast. Seems like it's one of those feast days. And if you hurry, you'll be able to catch him. And so they get up into the city, and they see Samuel coming toward them on his way up to the high place. Now, we have a little break in the narrative to reveal to us that God has prepared Samuel. He knows that he's going to be meeting a man from the land of Benjamin who will be anointed as, and we'll talk more about this momentarily, anointed as prince or commander or leader over my people Israel. So Samuel knows that Saul is coming, though he doesn't know his name. He knows he's going to meet a man from Benjamin and to be prepared to talk to him. Now, we need to talk about a couple things here with God's intent. One is that God says he will be anointed as, my translation says prince, over my people Israel. Your translation probably says something like commander or leader or ruler, not king. It says something other than king. And this is kind of a glaring word choice. It's the word nagid in Hebrew rather than malak. And the two are not totally distinct from each other. I do not want to give you the idea that Saul was not anointed king, because later on he is called king. That word king is used about him, but the first time that Saul is described here and that God's plan is given, the word king is not used. Instead, this other word is used. Anyone have any ideas as to why? Did you do any research on this ahead of time? Not sure if this jumped out at you or not. I don't want to overstate the point for sure. Like I said, the point is not going to be that Saul was not king or that God was not really happy to anoint him as king. This is God's choice, and he is going to rule over the people. But this word, nagid, has more of an emphasis on, I think, two things. One, the military component of Saul's rule. And this goes into what the people were looking for. The people, one of their stated reasons for wanting a king was that so he can fight their battles for them. And so God tells Samuel, look, you are going to anoint this man as commander, as military leader and ruler over Israel. Israel is getting what they want out of Saul, for better or for worse. Secondly, and you can decide if you like this explanation or not, I think there's a possible emphasis on the fact that God is not giving up his place as king. That even though Saul is going to be anointed as a physical king, and the word is correct to identify him as such, God is still king even over Saul. God is still the ultimate ruler of them. Mark?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important part of all of this story.
Yeah.
Because all these things are happening, but we see even later that God tries to resolve the issue of incorrect thinking about him. They're still not thinking about God correctly, the people as a whole. And he addresses it. That's
Right.
part of this whole story.
It is part of the whole story, that they're not respecting God for who he is. They're more interested in having that military commander and somebody who's like the nations around them rather than letting God lead them. And this word being used is just a weird choice normally. And so it has to be identified as a very deliberate choice, that Saul is going to fill the purpose that Israel wants, but that God is still ultimately in control. Gary.
It's just all interesting. You know, you have said in the past, sin complicates things.
Sure does.
And that's just in this whole story, really, of it was the people's idea to want a king.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, as we brought out, according to Scripture, God knew there would be a king. So that doesn't really contradict each other. God knows, he knew what people would do.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting the way things go down. They wanted a king, not God.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we want a king like the other nations. And the other nations, what kings were, people worship them.
Yeah.
They wanted worship. They made people bow down to them. So, yeah,
Right.
the fact that the people gave up on God completely as their king
Yeah.
is pretty evident.
Yeah. I'll go one step further than you in that I'll say that God, like I mentioned before, God was okay with the concept of them having a king. And that God was doing more than just allowing them to have a king, that his intent, it seems, was to eventually bless them with a king. The problem with it here, and the reason why God is not happy about it, is because this is the wrong reason and the wrong timing. This is man wanting to do things his own way. And so it all would have worked out much better in them. It's a little bit like looking at the Garden of Eden and seeing the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That they were not supposed to eat of it, or of a tree of life that was there, that they were not forbidden to eat. Why are those things there? For God to bless them with later? It's there as more than just, here's a temptation for you that I'm going to test and see if you will do what I say. God put it in there in the garden, I believe, with the intent to bless Adam and Eve with it eventually. But doing it in their timing and for their reasons ruins the whole thing. It's now an act of rebellion against God. You have the same sort of thing here. This is an act of rebellion against God when a king could have been a blessing for them. Dave?
Yeah, exactly. I don't believe it was God was hating Saul.
No.
I mean, not really, that's the wrong word, but you know what I'm saying. It was the people. And so you can see God's hand in this. Who's the first guy he asked about what a seer is?
Yeah.
Samuel.
Yeah.
You could say that's a coincidence, but I don't think so.
Right.
And the other thing is, he provided Samuel to go talk to him. So Samuel must have some form of communication with God, because he's going to talk with him a couple times.
Right.
And I believe he's trying to tell him you're going to be the king. Now, I'm saying all this for a reason. The reason is Saul had every opportunity given by God to be a great king, a
Yes.
good king, a godly king. It's his fault when he doesn't do that.
Right.
So, just wondering about that.
Absolutely. Because look at what God says to Samuel about Saul. Not just you will anoint him to be this commander of his ruler, but what is God's purpose for Saul? He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have seen my people, because their cry has come to me. We can say all we want that Israel's motivations were bad, but a lot of times in Judges, their motivations were bad, and God still raised up a deliverer for them because he was merciful to them. Their motivations for wanting Saul were rotten, but God was going to work to use this as an opportunity to bless them anyway. And that Saul has this chance to be a great king, to be a faithful king, to be righteous. And if he will seize it, then even out of their bad motivations, something good can come.
It doesn't seem like God feels like this will be the king that leads the people back to him, but more of a military style leader that'll give the people what they need.
Yeah. And I agree with that. And again, Saul has the chance to be more godly and more righteous. But God also doesn't say anything about Saul leading the people back to him. In reality, the people are getting the king. Actually, they're getting a king that's better than they deserve, truly. But they're getting a king who has the focus that they want, for better or for worse.
Is there any way of knowing about how long this is after the tribe of Benjamin was almost wiped out? How many generations? Is there any way of getting some timeline there? Because they were still a small nation.
Right.
They were at least.
Right. Offhand, I don't know. I will try to see if I can figure out how many years that's been, or if we have an estimate on that. Mark?
Yeah, I don't know what the timeline is, but when I read this without knowing the end, Saul really looks like he's a fairly humble guy here.
Yeah.
And we see what happens when the people choose a king later, as opposed to God choosing a king.
Right.
And it goes to his head, everything goes south. We know the ending of the story. Not to inject that while we read this. He's a very humble guy here. He asks, I'm just a Benjamin. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You want me to do all this stuff? He's questioning what's going on here. He's like, wow, I just was going to ask you about my donkey. What's going on here? And he seems very humble in this beginning part.
He does.
And he's not the guy who should be the king.
Right.
You know that. But here, he just seems like a fairly humble guy who
Yeah.
just wants to find his donkeys for his dad, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
he's thrust into this thing that we know he doesn't handle later.
And that's a pretty humble perspective from somebody who comes from a wealthy family and, could very easily be inflated and arrogant. There's so much that is good about Saul here. There is good potential, and I 100% agree with that. I want us to resist the urge to try to paint, and I don't think that's what we're doing, but to try to paint Saul with a binary brush. He has to be all good or all bad. I think we need to recognize him as he is, like we all are, that we have good and bad things about us, that Saul mostly looks good here. Absolutely. Probably overwhelmingly so looks good here. We only have a couple of hints and little questions about what could be happening in the future, plus this strange wording of saying he's going to be the commander, and not using that king word, plus then how we know that the story ends. But overall, Saul has a good purpose. He has a good attitude about his purpose. He has the potential to be a good and righteous king that's 1,000 times better than Israel deserves, because Israel doesn't care about any of that. I'm a lot more negative and pessimistic about Israel than I am about Saul at this point, because Israel doesn't care about all these things. Yeah, okay?
He definitely did not want to be king.
Right. And again, that's impressive. I had a professor in a history class say one time, the problem with democracy is that anybody who wants to be president probably shouldn't be president. That if you're arrogant enough to think that you can do it, that should exclude you right away. And that is sort of the conundrum, right? And to have a high enough opinion of yourself to say, yes, I should be king over all of Israel. I think there is a way that can be done appropriately, but historically, most people are greedy for the power and the prestige and the riches and all of that. Saul's humble enough to not be looking for that sort of thing. Again, there's great potential here for him. Next week, we will talk about the meal beginning in verse 22 that happens, and there's only just a little bit left in chapter 9, so we will definitely move on to the next lesson about how Saul is actually anointed king. Thank you.